Some people go through life like this, and I went through life in all directions, and I think that was an absolute delight. I don't know what prompts you to do various things in your life. Sometimes you're forced into learning something. Other times you want desperately to get into a particular area. But let's see, I was born in Baltimore. We lived in several places in Baltimore. A place just outside of Baltimore. And then we went to a town called Sparrows Point near Baltimore, where my father worked. We lived in a bungalow initially, then we went to 221 East Street and then 526 East Street, and it was delightful. Good neighbors, they're all working class families. They all knew what the other one did. We didn't think in racial terms. We thought in terms of friends or enemies, I suppose, but mostly friends. It's crazy, I remember these things, because as a kid, we moved and moved and moved and moved. I guess as my father climbed up his little ladder. Was I a troublemaker? I don't remember that, but maybe I was. I got involved in reading at a very tender age because my mother read a lot. That helped me in college. And it helped me later as a navigator and as a pilot, learning everything you didn't have to know. I was a little bit older in work ethic than a lot of kids my age. I was a senior patrol leader in my Boy Scout troop, led my troop. Without a scoutmaster, I took my troop up to a nearby town and marched them on a 4th of July parade, and another time I took the troop up to Baltimore and marched them, and so forth. And when you do that, you've got to learn something. You've got to learn how to deal with people. You've got to make things somewhat pleasant for them. And that was always delightful. So I learned something about later teaching by just being in the Boy Scout troop as a senior patrol leader. But we'd go out to the camp on the weekends for 2 nights. It was just great. And we also had a rowboat. And as a senior patrol leader, I did all the steering. I didn't have to do any of the rowing. We went from the camp over to the Bethlehem Steel Company's shipyard so that the Boy Scouts could go through a ship to see how it was being built from top to bottom. And once we did that, then we rode back to camp, and it was about a 4 or 5 mile rowing trip. And on the way back, I was, let's go on, let's go. And so they threw me overboard, and then hauled me back in, and I was a troop leader. At times, I managed the theater. And I don't know why the manager was off so much, but they had me take over. Now my father worked steadily in the mill, and as a consequence, I didn't see him very often. But I worked for my mother because she was running the boarding house. I think I learned discipline there because you had to satisfy all the workers with what you prepared for them. Not only that, I washed dishes and made beds and that sort of thing. And as a consequence, I think I learned a lot about doing my job, no matter what it was, whatever was given to me to do. You always have to look beyond just the words that said, you will do this, you will do that. I did all sorts of things at school. In fact, they used me as a model one time, but I was in the choir and, just everything you do in high school. I played baseball. I was on my high school team. I was a catcher or a first baseman as needed. School was fun. I really enjoyed it. The school I went to, I got a superb education. I lived in a town, Bethlehem Steel Town, and all the bosses' sons went to our high school. So our teachers were top grade. We had people with lots of experience because of their families' backgrounds. Boy, it just lifted me up time after time after time. I was selected with a couple other young boys my age as a thinking group. I don't know what you call them in high school, but you become one of the so-called leaders. And I had worked myself up. And by the time I was a senior, I was helping run things. Some of the teachers asked me to give lectures because I'd read so much history. I guess that prepared me for later teaching in college. I wound up in graduation giving a talk from the platform and so forth. So something happened to me. I had such good teachers because when I went to college I was Phi Beta Kappa, Phi Alpha Theta awards for my college work. My mother was a very, very hard worker. I guess at a very tender age in life, she taught me a lot to build my mind. I gave her great credit in life and loved her dearly. I just patterned myself after her work. I love my father too, but he went early in his 50s because he just couldn't stay away from the bottle. But he treated us boys marvelously well. I can't complain that way, but I didn't have him around for very long when he went in his 50s. So I don't know how to explain that. Oh, I thought I would eventually go into the mill. That was normal because I was from a working class family and we didn't have money to send me to college or anything like that. And my two brothers expected that they would do the same thing. It was unthinkable when I was 16, 17 years old. I thought I'd go to work in the mill. And the war came along and boom.
These men are aviation cadets. A short while ago, they too were average American boys from average American families. In the near future, they will have learned many things.
I've read a lot about warfare of all types.
Total war, patterned by the Nazis for all Europe, comes at last to Germany. This is the frontier town of Aachen, the first to fall under the full weight of Allied military might. Because the Nazi commander Bill refused to surrender, the city was bombed and shelled for 12 days before the American First Army took the town.
We knew we were quite possibly going into the military, which did indeed occur. My younger brother became a paratrooper, jumped into Japan at the end of the war. And my older brother was captured by the Germans in Italy. He was an infantry soldier. I luckily went into the Air Force, I guess it was Army Air Force then. I was off into basic training, and at basic training I took an exam and it qualified me to go into navigation school. And that's when I went off to High Point, North Carolina. They wanted all their officers to have some college training. So I got my time there and then went into the actual training. And boom, I was off into the pilot world and became a navigator. I flew in B-17s out of Valley, Wales, and we flew into Germany, across France into Germany. You don't know you're being shot at times. So I'm sure if they were there, they were shooting at us, but missing. They never hit our airplane. When that war was just about over with, I was sent out to a unit in northeast India because the Japanese were moving down through China, and it was very fearful that they would go into India. I don't remember any combat when I was in India, but we patrolled the northeast border of India to make sure that there were no Japanese troops coming down. Mankind is wonderful. I'm glad God put us here, but He didn't eliminate the malfunction of the human mind at times. And yet, there are great accomplishments. If you're a good Christian, you know the value of Christ, the value of popes, but inevitably there are problems in the world. But warfare seems to be one of the constancies of life. As an old history professor, goodness knows how many wars I've had to teach about in all parts of the world. It's not just in one area, it's been everywhere, even in this country. So we're lucky because we've had so little compared to Europe and Asia and to Africa and even South America. But that goes on and on and on and on. I came back to the U.S. and was assigned to a unit on Guam. By then I was an instructor navigator, and so I was teaching a lot of new navigators various things about overwater flying and so forth. And so I flew for 2 years out there and flew all the way to the South Pole. I flew to Australia, many times to Hawaii, Tinian, Saipan. I got to Japan quite often. On all those trips, I got to just walk the streets of Tokyo, and that was good because you get to see the people of the place in their normal circumstances. And everything was politeness as far as I was concerned. No one ever shouted at me or said, "Get out of our country," or anything like that. No, it was very, very nice, very polite. I didn't know it at the time, but I was in a learning situation. I was learning the world, literally. I hit most of the islands in the Pacific, all the way to the South Pole. I'd flown to Greenland, Iceland, and so forth. I had made trips on ship around Africa and around South America. In fact, a ship took me all the way across the Pacific. I got overseas very early in life, and so I got to understand the thinking in a lot of different countries and why they were the way they were. There's always pressure in the world. Nations pushing other nations, and having to deal with those kind of pressures makes a young person just learning about life, gives them prejudice or gives them learning on what to expect from others. In the 400 block, this little girl lived. She was a couple years younger than I, and she lived just a block down the street from where I did. And when I went down to the Boy Scout Hall or to the theater, I would go by her house, and she might be out and I would see her. And so I watched this little girl grow up. And I went into the military, and when I came back from my duty, here was this grown girl, and I fell in love. And her family had moved up into Baltimore, so I had to go up to Baltimore to see her. And her family offered me a room there when I would come up. I'd come up on a streetcar. I don't think I had a car at the time. She had a date at one place, and I got there to see her, and she took me in and showed me to all of her friends and so forth. But one girl had to go home, and she said, well, I'll have Bill take you home. And so Bill took this girl home. Very pretty thing, don't get me wrong. But I came back, and I kept pursuing this young lady. And so we fell in love, and we got married. With our backgrounds were so similar that we just got along wonderfully all of our lives. It was a magical marriage. It was just marvelous. And we were only married a little over 69 years. And we had 3 great kids, so we were very happy. I guess we had one of the happiest marriages of all times. Yeah, I don't know why God served me so well, but He really helped me with her. I made one of the luckiest choices that was possible. I left the military at that time so I could go to college. I knew that was essential in my life because I'd been a reader from the time I was a pup. I got married and we went to a place called Towson State Teachers College. My history professor there told me he wanted me to go to Harvard or Yale, but I realized that I couldn't afford that on the GI Bill, and I didn't have enough money myself, and my mother didn't have enough money to support me there. So I chose to go to Indiana University, and that's a course where I did my good work, and that was an absolute joy. Wife and I lived in a trailer on campus along with a whole bunch of other probably ex-GIs. I knew that everything I knew was incomplete. There's always something else you should know. And so you try and try and try to build up your mind so that you're not surprised at any time. And the surprises come, but luckily I graduated near the top of my class at Indiana University, and I got some academic awards because of it. And with that done, I decided to return to active duty in the military, and I went to pilot training then. I realized that having been a navigator was a lot of fun, but the people who were going ahead in the military were usually the pilots and not the navigators. Now that's not always the case, but generally it was the case. So I went to pilot school, and boom, in very short order I was an instructor pilot because I'd been an instructor navigator and I knew what they did, and it was no problem catching up as a pilot. And that was a joy. It broadened my mind a little bit to how to deal with other people and to instruct and to correct and to get them back onto the track that they should be on. That was a lot of fun because I was being taught how to teach. And pretty soon I was off to another war, wasn't I?
In Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists.
Eventually I went to the Korean War. I served in a unit that flew over Korea. I decided to stay in the military, and the wars developed, and so off I went. But thank goodness I was a pilot for those, and that took me up the ladder a little bit. I was on Guam, so we had a long flight to get there. I love the flying, don't get me wrong, and I didn't mind the wars. My planes never got hit. In my life, it's been constant, almost constant conflict somewhere. And so, therefore mankind doesn't learn, because there are leaders who demand that their section of life persist and dominate certain aspects of life. And unfortunately that goes on and on and on and on. And unfortunately, despite the education that is given to the masses now, it still persists. There are some people it's not important to know the world. They live in an isolated environment and they don't want to get out of it. But for people who want to know about the world, it's well to travel it and to see it in its place, as opposed to just looking at it in a book. But by all means, if you're going to a place like that, you want to read about it before you go, and read as much as you can about it before you go, so you better understand how the people react, because there are different reactions in different environments. But fortunately, I never had any trouble that way. And in the military, if you went to a place or was assigned to a place, you got a lot of lectures before you were turned loose on the environment. And it was well to listen very carefully. So military people didn't have much trouble. At least the ones I knew didn't have any trouble, and I didn't have any trouble. Never got into trouble in the local environment. It is arrogance, I think, on the part of some people who think they've gotten in control of the United States and can do anything they want to do. And that's a shame. But it happens. It's the nature of the human being in some cases. I've been lucky to have a lot of good advantages in life. There aren't many kids from a mill town who get to fly the world or get to run around the world on cars and on foot, and to see other people, because I've been to every continent. I've flown near the North Pole in my own B-52. With the atomic weapons, we flew around 60,000 feet. It was normal business, pretty much. Once you get to do it time after time after time, all that kind of mental anguish goes away. Golly, I've flown the world, literally. I've flown the Atlantic and the Pacific, both north and south. It's just unbelievable that a kid from a mill town could have done those things. Yeah, but that's what the military does for you if you stay in. I served the country in a whole flock of ways. I got to full colonel, and so that allowed me to do a lot of things that ordinarily I would never have been able to do. I was sent to many places for military purposes, but I also visited places that I was just interested in, because I later became a history professor, and that information was rewarding, because I could understand better how those people reacted in different circumstances. One of the great joys of my life was being a professor of history at the Air Academy. I was the deputy in the history department there for 5 years. I mean, with all the flying I did, and I loved it, don't get me wrong, I really loved it. But I think teaching students as a professor was one of the great joys of my life. Because I'd been in the Boy Scouts, I was a senior patrol leader, and so many places I went, I had to teach this, that, or the other thing. I was very lucky before I got into the classroom, because I'd already been an instructor navigator and instructor pilot, and I had seen the world, and I knew what was going on in different parts of the world, which ordinarily a lot of the children to whom I talked had no idea of what it was like to be in France or to be in Germany or to be in China or India or North Africa or, you know, you name it. And so that was very helpful for me. I could explain some of the thinking of the world to the children who didn't have that amount of travel before they got into a classroom. So I was very lucky that way. And there was all my reading from the time I was a pup coming out of me and into the audience, into my classroom. The Mind is an incomplete article, and I told you about the awards that I got, but there's so much I don't know, I'm sure, because there's so many different aspects of life that one doesn't either get interested in or one doesn't get familiar with them. And while I did very, very well in my history work, there's enormous amount that I don't know. And I think probably as a teacher, you're aware of that there's a lot of vagueness in life too. As a professor, then you've got to understand the past as well as the present and the possible future. I had very good classes. I knew I did well at the Air Force Academy. My wife and I were in northern Florida at an air base getting ready to go overseas to another location in Europe, an assignment I had in Europe. And in came this class from the academy, and they were a class that I had taught. And they took my wife and me out to dine. This was about 40 or 45 young men, because they appreciated what I had taught them. So that was very nice. So I knew at that time that I'd done something right in my life other than marry my wife. My last real command was, I commanded a unit in Vietnam when I had about 55 aircraft in my outfit. We did a lot of bombing. For that one I was stationed in Japan, just outside of Tokyo, and I tried to fly almost every day and doing the same work that I was having my people do. But that was my third war, and so it was easier doing it than it would have been if it had been my first war. I'm not sure how to explain it, but I learned a lot from watching others do their jobs, and the superior ones I tried to follow. And you know, when you have to grade everybody else, you're grading yourself as well. Am I being fair to this individual? So forth. Try to understand why they are doing what they're doing, and then try to correct them if they're doing it incorrectly. But not savagely. Try to do it as gently as possible and without creating a crisis. And we never got hit, so with anti-aircraft fire. So I was very lucky. I was a letter writer, and I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote wherever I was. If I was at some place for any length of time, then I would get return letters, and she was very good that way. Of course, eventually we had 3 children, and so she couldn't move to every place I went. We were lucky to have 3 good children. Some parents can't say that. I attribute that to my wife. I was off flying so many times that she was in charge, most of the time with the kids. But I enjoyed my military career, and I enjoyed my children and my wife, because I wrote constantly, as did she. Other times we had them overseas with us. In my later life, I was able to take my children across the Atlantic. Thank goodness we were able to get our kids to to Europe and to Asia. And later in life, I got my wife into India. I turned my children loose in London. They found a park to the west of London and and they were only little fellows at the time, little girl and two boys. And they had a ball there. And I turned them loose in Paris, and they walked the main streets and found their way back to the hotel. And I didn't have to chase after them or anything. Later on, they all traveled by themselves. We're proud of them. They didn't let us down in any respect. I think if anyone helped my military life, it was my wife, because she filled our house wherever we went. We lived in Iran and Turkey overseas, and just marvelous.
Look up, darling. Look, the sky has turned to gold.
In Iran, I was giving advice to the Shah's, one of his outfits, and meeting with him. And she was there and was adored. We entertained a lot because I had to associate with foreign dignitaries. My wife was such a marvelous cook. She invited all my associates, foreign associates, to eat at our table. And we didn't have empty chairs. They came and thoroughly enjoyed everything that she put on the table for them. I'm glad that in my overseas locations where I worked, that my wife was there, because she really created a marvelous atmosphere for me and the people she invited to her home. They were just marvelous. So that helped me in my job, because they all appreciated what my wife had done. We got to see the world together, and that was just marvelous, because I got her all around the world. I keep thinking about her all the time, because I guess I had one of the wonderful marriages of all times. It was just absolutely marvelous. Two kids from working class families in a mill town who got out to see the United States, Canada, Mexico, Europe and Asia and so forth, and we're able to take our children to so many places in the world. It's just absolutely marvelous, because our kids didn't have the kind of lives that we grew up with, but they grew up and opened their eyes to an entire world. I don't know what they remember about me, because I don't ask them. But I've had a lot of good friends all over the world. So
how do you want to be remembered, Dad?
I think, if anything, it was a kid from a mill town and a working class family who managed to work his way up in society, in the military mostly, and to do something productive for the United States. As you know, I just lost my wife, but she was extremely happy with what happened to the children and the families they developed. I'm just pleased with the children that we produced and their lives that they have had. So we haven't had to take any one of them out of jail anywhere. Most children get jobs here in the United States and stay here, and they just get to meet with people much like themselves, so they don't get that overseas experience. And so as a consequence, in some cases it amounts to prejudice. As you probably might know, there are some children who don't get out and about, and they think they know everything, and it's hurtful for them and for others. And most of those do well enough to exist. They just don't excel in whatever it is that they should be doing. That's unfortunate, but that's the nature of the human being, I'm afraid. But a lot of those who pass that line do exceedingly well, and they're the ones who eventually tell us how to live and how to make ends meet, and to reach off into the atmosphere for more and more and more and more.